A young mother, just trying to care for her sick child, finds herself trapped in an impossible situation. When the Homeowners Association fines her for allowing unauthorized guests onto her property, a shocking truth is revealed. The guests were actually on-duty paramedics desperately racing to save her son's life. With time running out and the threat of escalating penalties, she must fight to prove her innocence and protect her family. This is the story of a system gone horribly wrong, and one woman's courageous stand against the powers that be. The sirens pierced the quiet suburban morning, their wails growing louder as the ambulance careened down the street. Inside, Amy gripped the side of her son's bed, her knuckles white with terror. 8-year-old Tommy's lips were turning blue, his wheezing breaths growing more ragged by the second. "Hang on, baby, just hang on," she pleaded, her voice cracking. The paramedics worked furiously, administering oxygen and injections, but Amy could see the worry etched on their faces. Suddenly, the ambulance screeched to a halt in front of her townhouse. The back doors flew open, and the paramedics rushed Tommy inside, Amy close behind them. As they burst through the front door, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Mrs. Wilkins, the HOA president, her arms crossed and a grim expression on her face. "What's the meaning of this?" she demanded, eyeing the commotion. "My son is having a severe asthma attack," Amy said breathlessly. "Please, we need to get him to the hospital right away." But Mrs. Wilkins held up a hand. "I'm afraid I can't allow that. You know the rules. No unauthorized guests are permitted on the premises without prior approval from the HOA. And those men," she gestured towards the paramedics, "do not have the proper identification." Amy's heart sank. "But they're paramedics. They're here to save my son's life." "That may be, but they're still uninvited guests," Mrs. Wilkins said sternly. "I'm going to have to fine you for this violation." "Fine me?" Amy cried, her voice rising in panic. "My son is dying. You can't do this." The lead paramedic stepped forward, his face etched with concern. "Ma'am, please, this child is in critical condition. We need to get him to the hospital immediately." Mrs. Wilkins shook her head. "I'm sorry, but rules are rules. You'll have to leave, and I'll be issuing a citation to the homeowner." Amy felt the world spin around her as she watched the paramedics reluctantly retreat back to the ambulance, its sirens fading into the distance. Tears streamed down her face as she turned to Mrs. Wilkins, her voice trembling with desperation. "Please, you have to understand. My son's life is at stake. You can't do this to us." But Mrs. Wilkins remained unmoved, her expression cold and unyielding. "I'm afraid I can, and I have." The stark finality of her words hung in the air, leaving Amy paralyzed with fear and disbelief. As the ambulance disappeared around the corner, she knew that her family's future now hung in the balance, all because of a heartless rule and an uncompromising HOA president. Amy sat in the dim hospital waiting room, her head in her hands. The minutes ticked by like hours as she waited for news about Tommy. After the horrific encounter with Mrs. Wilkins, the paramedics had rushed him to the ER, but she had been forced to follow behind in her car, unable to ride with him. Now, alone and terrified, she replayed the scene over and over in her mind. How could the HOA president have been so heartless, so callously indifferent to her son's life-threatening emergency? It was a nightmare, a cruel twist of fate that her family now faced fines and possible legal action, all while Tommy's condition hung in the balance. Just then, the ER doors burst open, and a doctor hurried towards her, his face grave. "Mrs. Parsons, I'm Dr. Emerson. I'm afraid your son's condition is very serious. His asthma attack triggered a severe respiratory crisis, and he's currently on a ventilator. We're doing everything we can, but—" Amy felt the air leave her lungs. "But what? Please, tell me he's going to be okay." Dr. Emerson hesitated, his eyes filled with empathy. "I won't sugarcoat it. Tommy is in critical condition. We've stabilized him for now, but the next 24 hours will be absolutely crucial. I'm so sorry, but you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that—" His voice trailed off, but Amy knew what he was implying. Panic and grief threatened to overwhelm her as she struggled to process the doctor's words. Her little boy, her precious Tommy, might not make it. Shakily, she rose to her feet. "Can I see him? Please, I need to be with him." Dr. Emerson nodded. "Of course. Follow me." As Amy hurried down the sterile hospital corridors, her mind raced. How could this be happening? She had done everything right. Taken Tommy to his doctor appointments, made sure he had his inhalers, watched over him like a hawk. And now, because of a heartless bureaucrat and her ridiculous rules, her son's life hung by a thread. Reaching the ICU, Amy paused at the door, steeling herself for what she might see. But nothing could have prepared her for the sight of her little boy, so pale and vulnerable, hooked up to a tangle of tubes and machines, struggling to breathe. Choking back a sob, she rushed to his bedside, gently taking his hand. "Tommy, Mommy's here. I'm right here, baby. You have to fight. Okay. You have to come back to me." As she watched her son's chest rise and fall with the aid of the ventilator, Amy felt a surge of determination. She would do whatever it took to save him, even if it meant going to war with the unforgiving HOA. Nothing was going to stop her from protecting her child, no matter the cost. Amy paced the hospital lobby, her phone glued to her ear as she frantically tried to reach her husband, Jack. After hours of agonizing uncertainty, the doctors had finally given her a glimmer of hope. Tommy's condition had stabilized, and they were cautiously optimistic about his chances for recovery. But now she had to figure out how to handle the looming crisis with the HOA. "Come on, Jack. Pick up," she muttered, her heart racing. She needed her husband by her side, not stuck on a business trip halfway across the country. Finally, the line connected. "Amy? What's wrong? Is Tommy okay?" "Oh, Jack, it's a nightmare," Amy cried, the words tumbling out. She described the horrific encounter with Mrs. Wilkins and the HOA's heartless refusal to let the paramedics treat their son. "They fined us? For letting the paramedics help Tommy?" Jack's voice was laced with disbelief and outrage. "That's insane. What the hell kind of homeowners association is this?" "I don't know, but we have to do something, Jack. They're threatening us with more fines and possible legal action. And Tommy's still in critical condition. The doctors say the next 24 hours are crucial." All right, calm down," Jack said, his tone urgent but reassuring. "I'm booking the first flight back. Just hold tight, and don't worry about the HOA for now. I'll take care of it." Amy let out a shaky breath. "Okay. Hurry, Jack. I need you here." "I'm on my way, honey. And don't you worry, we're going to get through this. I promise." As Amy hung up the phone, she felt a glimmer of hope. With Jack by her side, maybe they could find a way to fight back against the HOA's cruelty and save their son. But the weight of the situation still felt crushing, and she couldn't shake the nagging fear that time might be running out. Steeling herself, she turned and headed back towards the ICU, her steps quickening with determination. She wouldn't give up, not when Tommy's life was on the line. This was a battle she had to win, no matter the cost. As she approached the unit, she spotted a familiar figure in the hallway. Mrs. Wilkins, her face impassive as she spoke to a security guard. Amy's blood boiled, and before she could stop herself, she was charging towards the woman, her hands clenched into fists. "You!" she cried, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you show your face here, after what you've done?" Mrs. Wilkins turned, her eyes widening in surprise. "Mrs. Parsons, Don't you Mrs. Parsons me," Amy spat. "My son is fighting for his life because of your heartless, petty rules. I swear, if anything happens to him, I'll—" The security guard stepped forward, placing a hand on Amy's arm. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down and step back." But Amy shrugged him off, her focus locked on the HOA president. "No, I won't calm down. This woman is responsible for my son's condition, and I want answers." Mrs. Wilkins opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a commotion erupted from the ICU. Amy whirled around, her heart racing, as a team of doctors and nurses rushed past her, their faces etched with urgency. "What's happening?" she cried, her voice barely above a whisper. The security guard placed a hand on her shoulder. "I think you better come with me, ma'am." As Amy followed him back towards the ICU, a sense of dread settled in the pit of her stomach. Whatever was happening, she knew it couldn't be good. And in that moment, she realized that the battle to save her son had only just begun. Amy followed the security guard back towards the ICU, her heart pounding in her chest. The sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. A team of doctors and nurses were huddled around Tommy's bed, their faces etched with concern. "What's happening?" she cried, rushing forward. "Is he okay?" One of the nurses looked up, her expression grave. "Ma'am, your son's condition has taken a turn for the worse. We're doing everything we can, but—" She was interrupted by the shrill beeping of the heart monitor, and the room erupted into a flurry of activity. Doctors shouted orders, nurses rushed to adjust the tubes and machines, and Amy felt a wave of pure terror wash over her. "No, no, no," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Tommy, please, hold on." She tried to push her way towards the bed, but the security guard held her back. "Ma'am, you need to stay back. The doctors need space to work." Amy struggled against his grip, tears streaming down her face. "That's my son. I have to be with him." "I understand, ma'am, but you have to let the medical team do their job," the guard said gently. "If you interfere, it could make the situation worse." Defeated, Amy watched helplessly as the doctors continued their desperate efforts to stabilize Tommy. The minutes ticked by like hours, and the beeping of the heart monitor grew weaker and more erratic. Amy felt as if her own heart was about to burst from the sheer agony of it all. Finally, one of the doctors stepped back, his face etched with sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Parsons. We've done everything we can, but his condition is rapidly deteriorating. I'm afraid we may have to." Amy didn't hear the rest of his words. The world seemed to spin around her, and all she could focus on was the sound of the heart monitor's steady, rhythmic beeps slowing to a terrifying crawl. Her knees buckled, and she would have crumpled to the floor if not for the security guard's strong arms catching her. "No, please, no," she cried, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tommy, you can't leave me. You can't." But as the final, agonizing beep echoed through the room, Amy knew that her worst nightmare had come true. Her son, her precious little boy, was gone. In that moment, the weight of her grief threatened to consume her. She screamed, she wept, she raged against the cruel twist of fate that had snatched her child from her. And through it all, the looming specter of the HOA and its heartless president hung over her, a constant reminder of the injustice that had led them to this devastating conclusion. As the doctors and nurses retreated, their heads bowed in solemn silence, Amy felt a surge of white-hot fury. This couldn't be the end. She wouldn't allow it. She would fight, with every fiber of her being, to bring her son back and make those responsible pay for their cruelty. And with that, a new determination took hold. Her grief would not define her. It would fuel her, drive her forward, and lead her to the justice that her family so rightly deserved. The funeral was a somber affair, filled with the quiet sobs of family and friends, all struggling to come to terms with the sudden and devastating loss of young Tommy. Amy stood beside Jack, her face a mask of stoic grief, as they watched his tiny casket being lowered into the ground. In the days that followed, Amy found herself adrift in a fog of pain and anger. She couldn't shake the feeling that her son's death was not just a tragedy, but a gross injustice, one that demanded retribution. And at the center of it all was the figure of Mrs. Wilkins, the uncompromising HOA president whose callous disregard for Tommy's life had set off the chain of events that led to this devastating outcome. As the funeral guests filed out, Amy caught sight of the imposing woman, standing alone near the edge of the cemetery. Without a moment's hesitation, she stormed over to her, her eyes blazing with fury. "This is your fault," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "If you had just let the paramedics do their job, my son would still be alive." Mrs. Wilkins flinched, her usual air of composure cracking for a brief moment. Mrs. Parsons eyed. "Don't you dare try to apologize." Amy spat. "Your precious rules and your heartless enforcement of them cost my son his life. And I'm not going to rest until you and that entire HOA are held accountable." "I understand your grief, Mrs. Parsons, but—" "Understand?" Amy cried, cutting her off. "You couldn't possibly understand what I'm going through. My son is dead because of you, and nothing you say can ever make that right." She stepped closer, her eyes narrowed to slits. "Mark my words, Mrs. Wilkins, I'm going to make you pay for this. I'm going to bring down the entire HOA and everything you stand for. And when I'm done, your precious rules won't mean a damn thing." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed away, leaving the stunned HOA president in her wake. Jack, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, hurried to catch up with her. "Amy, what are you going to do?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Whatever it takes, Jack," she replied, her jaw set with determination. "I'm not going to let them get away with this. They killed our son, and I'm going to make sure they pay for it." Jack reached out, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "I understand how you feel, but going after the HOA, that's not going to bring Tommy back. We need to focus on grieving, on healing. Let the authorities handle this." Amy shook her head, her eyes blazing with resolve. "No, Jack. This is my fight, and I'm not going to let it go. I'm going to make them pay, even if it's the last thing I do." As they walked away, Amy could feel the weight of her loss pressing down on her. But it was more than just grief. It was a burning desire for justice, a need to ensure that her son's death would not be in vain. And she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she would stop at nothing to make the HOA and its heartless president pay for what they had done. In the weeks that followed, Amy's grief morphed into a relentless crusade against the HOA and its unforgiving policies. She pored over every rule and regulation, searching for any loopholes or inconsistencies that she could exploit. Jack tried to reason with her, urging her to focus on healing and moving forward, but Amy was unshakable in her determination. "This isn't just about us, Jack," she said, her eyes burning with intensity. "It's about every family in this neighborhood who's at the mercy of these ridiculous rules. I can't let Tommy's death be in vain. I have to make sure no one else suffers the way we have." With a steely resolve, Amy began reaching out to other homeowners, gathering signatures for a petition to reform the HOA. Slowly but surely, a groundswell of support began to build, as residents who had long chafed under the HOA's oppressive rule rallied behind her cause. Mrs. Wilkins, for her part, remained steadfast in her defense of the HOA's policies. She dismissed Amy's petition as emotional grandstanding, and insisted that the rules were in place for the community's greater good. "The rules are there to protect property values and maintain the integrity of our neighborhood," she told a local news reporter. "We can't make exceptions, no matter how tragic the circumstances. It's a matter of fairness and consistency." But Amy refused to be cowed. She organized town hall meetings, rallied her neighbors, and even enlisted the help of a team of lawyers to challenge the HOA's authority. As the battle lines were drawn, tensions in the community reached a boiling point, with neighbors divided and emotions running high. Through it all, Amy remained undaunted, her grief-fueled determination only growing stronger with each setback. She knew that the path ahead would be long and arduous, but she was more than willing to fight, even if it meant taking on the entire HOA establishment single-handedly. "They took my son from me," she said, her voice low and resolute, "and I'm not going to stop until I make them pay for it." As the conflict escalated, the media began to take notice, casting a national spotlight on the small suburban community and its warring factions. The HOA's unyielding stance and Amy's unwavering crusade captured the public's imagination, and soon the story was drawing attention from activists, lawmakers, and even the courts. With the stakes higher than ever, Amy knew that she was nearing a pivotal moment in her fight for justice. The entire world was watching, and the fate of her family and her son's legacy hung in the balance. The courtroom was a cauldron of tension as Amy Parsons took the stand, her eyes shining with a resolute determination. For weeks, she had been embroiled in a high-stakes legal battle with the HOA, fighting to hold the organization and its president, Mrs. Wilkins, accountable for the tragic death of her son, Tommy. As she recounted the horrific events that had transpired on that fateful day, her voice wavered with emotion, but her resolve never faltered. She described the agonizing moments when the paramedics were denied access to her son, and the heartbreaking consequences that followed. "My child died because of the HOA's heartless and inflexible policies," she told the judge, her gaze unwavering. "They prioritized their arbitrary rules over the life of a sick, vulnerable boy. And I'm here to make sure that never happens to another family in this community ever again." The HOA's legal team, led by the formidable Mrs. Wilkins, fought back with a vengeance. They argued that the rules were in place to maintain order and protect property values, and that any exceptions would undermine the entire system. "We cannot make special accommodations, no matter the circumstances," Mrs. Wilkins testified, her expression steely. "The rules apply equally to all homeowners, and we have a responsibility to enforce them consistently." But Amy's legal team, bolstered by the outpouring of public support, refused to back down. They presented a damning case, highlighting the HOA's lack of compassion and the devastating impact of their policies on vulnerable families. As the trial wore on, the courtroom became a battleground, with both sides adamantly defending their positions. The stakes were high, not just for Amy and her family, but for the entire community that had rallied behind her cause. Finally, after weeks of intense deliberation, the judge delivered his verdict. With a solemn expression, he condemned the HOA's actions, declaring their rules and enforcement policies to be inhumane, unjust, and in direct violation of basic human rights. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom as the judge ordered the HOA to pay a substantial fine and implement sweeping reforms to their policies, including provisions for emergency situations and the protection of vulnerable individuals. Amy, her face etched with a mixture of grief and triumph, rose from her seat, her eyes brimming with tears. "This is for you, Tommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I promised I'd make them pay, and I kept my word." As the spectators erupted into applause, Amy knew that her son's legacy would live on, not just in her heart, but in the changes that would ripple through the community, ensuring that no other family would have to endure the same unbearable loss. With a renewed sense of purpose, she turned to face the somber figure of Mrs. Wilkins, who stood defeated, her expression one of grudging respect. In that moment, Amy knew that the battle had been won, and that justice, however bittersweet, had finally been served. In the aftermath of the landmark court ruling, the once rigid HOA found itself in the midst of a sweeping transformation. Amy Parsons, her grief tempered by a fierce determination to honor her son's memory, had emerged victorious, securing a historic victory that would reverberate far beyond the confines of the quiet suburban neighborhood. As the community grappled with the fallout, Amy and her husband, Jack, worked tirelessly to ensure that the HOA's new policies reflected a genuine commitment to compassion and flexibility. They insisted on the creation of an emergency response protocol that would allow for the immediate and unfettered access of first responders, no matter the circumstances. "This is about saving lives, plain and simple," Amy said, her voice unwavering. No more arbitrary rules, no more senseless bureaucracy. When someone's in trouble, the only thing that should matter is getting them the help they need, as quickly as possible. Her words struck a chord with the newly chastened HOA leadership, who recognized the need for a fundamental shift in their organizational culture. Under the watchful eye of the court and the media, they embarked on a series of sweeping reforms, consulting with medical professionals, first responders, and community advocates to craft a set of guidelines that prioritize the well-being of residents above all else. As the changes took hold, a tangible sense of relief and gratitude began to spread through the neighborhood. Families who had once lived in fear of the HOA's heavy-handed tactics now found themselves empowered, knowing that their needs and concerns would be met with compassion and understanding. For Amy, the transformation was bittersweet. While she took immense pride in the positive impact her fight had made, the ache of Tommy's absence remained a constant companion. But in the quiet moments, she knew that her son's legacy lived on, not just in the policies that bore his name, but in the lives that would be saved by the newfound humanity of the HOA. As the community gathered to dedicate a memorial garden in Tommy's honor, Amy stood beside Jack, their hands entwined, their eyes shining with a mixture of grief and hope. They knew that the road ahead would not be an easy one, but they were determined to ensure that their son's memory would endure, a beacon of light in a world that had once been shrouded in darkness. "This is for you, Tommy," Amy whispered, her voice barely audible. "We did it, sweetheart. We made them listen, and now no one else will have to suffer like we did. You'll never be forgotten, my love. Never." With those words, Amy and her family turned to face the future, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of purpose and the promise of a better, more compassionate world, one that would never again allow the senseless sacrifice of a child's life in the name of bureaucratic callousness.